Hello, students. Welcome to the next lecture on Indian writing in English, an introduction. We have looked at the development of Indian writing in English, or how English language itself has influenced Indian writing more in general, even including vernaculars during the 18th and 19th centuries. In today's lecture, we'll be looking at what are the major developments that take place in the 20th century. There are two issues that we'll be looking at in some detail. One of that is the language question that ranges from the end of 19th century to up until 1960s, and traces of which we can still see today in our contemporary discussions in the last few years as well. And another issue that I want to focus today's lecture on is the accusation of Anglomania among the people who choose to write in English in India. So let's get into it. The language question of the 20th century begins have its early beginnings in the towards the end of 19th century. This language misgivings, as you have seen, there has been a lot of influence of English in the vernacular literatures that are being produced in the 19th century. But towards the end of 19th century, there is a trend of nativism or Deshwad, that is the native, the vernacular is prioritized over the foreign or the English. So this trend begins at the end of the 19th century but is shelved for a while because a more important argument begins at the turn of the century, which is the need for a national language. We need a national language to unite a nation that is divided along linguistic lines and religious lines and caste lines. So, to bring together this group of people for the purpose of nationalism, for uh, fighting against the British, to unite the Indian subcontinent, there was a question of a unified language. Most of the proponents argued for either Hindi or Hindustani. Let me elaborate the difference between Hindi and Hindustani. Hindi here means the Hindustani here means which is propagated. Hindustani was propagated by Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru and the likes as the possibility for the future of Indian subcontinent to put up a unified front. This Hindustani that Gandhi and others talk about is a mixture of Hindi and Urdu that is spoken in various parts of the country. And it could be written both in Devanagari or Persian script. But Hindi, as propagated by Hindi Sahitya Sammelan, which was established in 1910 and also was the preferred language for leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, was a Sanskritized Hindi written exclusively in Devanagari script. In 1920s, from 1920s to 1950s, what we can see is a Gandhian phase in Indian writing in English. Why this is significant is because almost all writing done in English during that period had the ghost of Gandhi, either as an idea or as a character. Gandhi is a recurring existence in this 30-year period in all the writings that is being done in English, even in a lot of the non-fiction work that you can see. Gandhi is a major presence during this period. It is significant where Gandhi lay in this scheme of things in the language question. While Gandhi was a proponent of Hindustani as the unified language for the subcontinent, Gandhi also made a very famous remark when Mulkraj Anand asked if it is possible to use English as a creative language. He says to Mulkraj Anand, the purpose of writing is to communicate, isn't it? If so, say your say in any language that comes to hand. If the purpose of writing is to communicate, say your say in any language that comes to hand. That was Gandhi's stand. If you can convey your ideas, thought and ideas better in English, why not? Go ahead and do that. Go ahead and use English language. This was Gandhi's attitude towards English. In 1950, when Indian Constitution was established, English was included by Nehru. By Nehru's special insistence, English was included for the next 15 years, subject to review as the national language along with Hindi. So while Hindi has had edged Hindustani in the competition, English was also put in the mix by Nehru. Nehru foresaw the possibility that some of the Indian states will not be very happy on a Hindi imposition if a unified Hindi was argued for. Many of the states wouldn't buy it. This is something Nehru foresaw, and he was proven right. In 1960s, when the constitutional provision for English as a national language was coming to an end, which was supposed to end in 1965, when that time was near in the early 1960s in several parts of North India, there were groups of Hindi scholars who agitated demanding that English be completely eviscerated from the constitution and Hindi be proclaimed the unifying language um, of the of the state of India. But this was met with protests in the south led by Tamil Nadu. In the southern states, there were agitations for a pro-English agitation demanding that English be maintained as one of the languages and against the imposition of Hindi. In 1963, the official language bill was passed by Nehru, assuring the larger masses that English will remain as a medium of communication and Hindi will not be imposed upon those states that do not want to use Hindi as an official language. It was also um, it was also assured that the central government jobs will not depend on a knowledge of Hindi. This bill came as an assurance, but also was met with different kind of reactions from different states. UP, for example, abolished English from their curriculum and did not made sure that it is not mandatory for their students to study English language, while Tamil Nadu removed Hindi from the curriculum and made sure that it is not compulsory or mandatory for students to study Hindi in schools. So this is something that we see happening in 1960s. But it, with the official language bill, the issue of language is almost settled. But it is also interesting to notice that it is at the same time that the accusations of Anglomania is at its peak, that Indian writers in English are targeted by writers in vernacular, start to be targeted by um, writers writing in vernacular. What is interesting to notice is that this is not a new phenomena. Even in the 19th century, there were writers who made fun of the uh, English speaking middle class of India, that they were caricatured, that they were talked about in very derogatory manners, especially the Bengali. The Bengali Sahib was often is the subject of ridicule and critique by vernacular writers. The Bengali Babu was a funny caricature of middle class Indians who had adapted to English language and who were seen as servile towards the British colonial rule. Buddhadeva Bose in 1963 writes an article that critiques this group of people who are still writing in English and says that Indo-Anglian poetry is a blind alley lined with curio shops leading nowhere. Bose argued that there is no future to this brand of poetry, and was very critical of Indian writers writing in English post independence. As a response to this criticism from Buddhadeva Bose, in 1969, P. Lal of the Writers' Workshop from Calcutta brought out a book called Modern Indian Poetry in English, an anthology and credo. It is a 600-page monumental work, which is the largest anthology, biggest anthology of modern Indian poetry ever to be published till date. It included 132 poets writing in English, and it also had a lengthy introduction from P. Lal arguing for the relevance of English language writing in India. And one of the most interesting parts of this was the responses of a questionnaire that P. Lal sent out to 75 Indian poets writing in English. He sent this letter, this questionnaire along with a copy of Buddhadeva Bose's article asking them for a response to Buddhadeva Bose. He asked whether they agree with Buddhadeva Bose's um, Buddhadeva's um, observation that Indian English poetry is a blind alley leading nowhere. He also asked if they agreed with the assumption that Buddhadeva Bose makes, or the observation that Bose makes, that best Indian English poetry is written by Sri Aurobindo. So um, P. Lal was very critical of Bose, and many of the respondents of his questionnaire also echo P. Lal's sentiment. Shyam Lal, later in the 80s, ridicules Indian writing in English as Shakuntala in skirts. It is in response to an old English phrase of accusation. An English critic who said Indian writing in English is like Matthew Arnold in a sari. But Shamlal said it is more like a Shakuntala in skirts. Both are derogatory terms, and Shamlal is being very derogatory to Indian writing in English when he says it is like a Shakuntala in skirts. Bhalchandra Namade, who is a fine Marathi poet in the 1960s, he was known as one of the avant-garde poets in Marathi literature. He accuses Indian writing in English of being the fine art of parrotry, that he says it is a mere imitation of the British writing. His position was very aggressive. Uh, while Bose and Lal were more along the lines of ridiculing Indian writers in English, Bhalchandra Made was more critical and aggressive towards these kind of writings and writers. He came from an ideological standpoint of Hindu revivalist nativism or Deshivad, and demanded for the he argued that there is no future, or there is no point in writing in English, creative writing in English, and that he was a proponent of the mm, vernacular writings in India. This animosity towards Indian writing in English is not cannot be seen in isolation. It is an animosity towards a particular class of people who are perceived to be the writers of Indian writings in English. Like the metropolitan, city-based Mumbai or Calcutta-based writers who are middle class and well educated and well, um, you know, well off, that who are rich enough. But this is a reductive view of Indian writing in English, as Arvind Krishna Mehrotra points out. There is some diversity in Indian writing in English, especially in that period up until 90s. There wasn't a lot of diversity, but there was still a lot of there was still some diversity in Indian writing in English. Not everybody was of the similar class, or not everybody wrote from a metropolitan center. But it is also interesting to look at the nuance of what it meant to be writing in English. All these writers were also multilingual, bilingual or multilingual, and some of them wrote in their mother tongues as much as they wrote in English. Dilip Chitre and Arun Koladkar are poetic examples of people writing in both Marathi and English. G. Patel wrote poetry both in Gujarati and English. Jayanta Mahapatra wrote in Odia and English. So there are many multilingual writers. There are many writers who also translated themselves from vernacular languages to English. O.V. Vijayan is one example. K. Sachidanandan is another example. So there are examples from Marathi like Vilas Sarin who translated themselves from the vernacular to English or vice versa. So this intermingling of languages is also something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about Indian writing in English. It does not exist in a vacuum. It coexists with other languages. So this is the end of the lecture. We have covered all the major talking points covered by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra in his introductory essay. In the future sessions, I will be looking at a broader sense of Indian writing in English and looking at some of the key texts that we